Well, welcome into the Backroads Bill podcast. I'm Ben, and today our guest is someone who has an intimate knowledge of union contracts, and he took his experience with that to write a novel on the Reesor Siding Tragedy, which was a labor dispute back in 1963 in Northern Ontario, and it had a lot of layers to it. It was an extremely complex labor dispute, but it got so heated, it actually led to 3 people dead and 8 more wounded. It was a great lesson on how not to handle a labor dispute. And there are, again, so many layers to this. Very interesting. So me and Bill chatted with Charles Beaudoin, who's better known as Andy. He recently published his novel called The Reesor Siding Tragedy, Canada's Bloodiest Labour Conflict. And his brother was actually a police officer who was on the scene that very night of the tragedy.
North Bay Echo is proud to partner with Twigs Coffee Roasters, a part of the community since 1995. Twigs offers a wide selection of quality beans, fresh roasted in-house every day. Find your favorite specialty drinks at our espresso bar, rejuvenate with freshly squeezed juice, or treat yourself to mouth-watering selections from our gourmet deli. And don't forget our irresistible fresh baked goods, including uncompromising gluten-free options. Twigs has 5 locations to serve you, from North Bay to Sturgeon Falls to Sudbury. Order online for pickup at twigs.ca. And coming soon, you'll be able to order fresh roasted coffee beans direct to your doorstep from our distribution center in North Bay.
Today we are joined by Charles Beaudoin, also goes by Andy. Welcome to the podcast.
Yes, thanks. Glad to be on with you.
Well, it's a real pleasure to have Andy on the Backroads Bill podcast, which goes everywhere. But and speaking of everywhere, it was somewhere this summer that I stopped called the Reesor Siding Monument, and between Hearst and Kapuskasing. I'm ashamed to say, Andy, and to all the listeners, that I've driven that Highway 11 north so many times over 4 or 5 decades, probably more than 100 times, and never stopped at the Reesor Monument. And I knew a little bit about it, but until I stopped, then I thought, of course I know a bit more because there's explanation. And then lo and behold, out of the blue, I found that there's a new book, and that's how we found you, and that's how I'm doing the Backroads Bill podcast and stories about this. And so here, all of a sudden, when I wanted to know more about it, that you and your book appeared, and so that's really the focus of today's podcast. So again, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. I'm glad you found the monument and that my book existed.
Yeah, exactly. And I'll say this near the end, but it's a worthwhile read because this is, as you say in the book, and people know, this is one of the bloodiest labor disputes in Canada, next to the Winnipeg General Strike. And another thing we talked about in the past here, the Onion Lake incident in Thunder Bay. So tell us a little bit about how you got started on the book, and of course it's going to include your brother and the like, but just give us a context how you came to write this book.
Well, I as you know, there are a lot of people who aspire to write books. I'm not one of those. I did enough writing when I had to submit assignments at university and working on a master's thesis and that kind of thing. But I was talking to my brother in his living room in 2019, and I happened to ask him, Ron, weren't you at Reesor Siding? And he wasn't a man who discussed at length and spoke in long sentences. He immediately turned to his wife and said, "Louise, do we still have that folder in the bedroom?" And off she went to get this brown manila envelope that had preserved the legal brief produced by the Crown Attorney in the case involving the incident at Reesor Siding. And there were clippings as well that Louise had cut out of newspapers. And so here this stuff was almost 60 years old. And I asked if I could take it with me. Once I got reading, I really felt that this was a story that should be told and should be written about. And I realized that most times when people write any kind of historical account, they don't have the luxury of actual documents produced by, police reports and Crown attorneys. So I felt that this was almost an obligation that I had to do material. So it was a slow process. It took several years for me to read what I wanted to read before I ever started writing. And at the end of 4 years, I had the book, and then it was time to look for a publisher.
Yeah, the book is very understandable, and I say that as a compliment because it has the various chapters, but you do a good job explaining the context. And I think for the listeners, you have to say that on that night of February 10th, 11th in 1963, 3 people were shot dead, about a dozen injured, and we're going to now discuss the context of how that happened. And in the story that I'm writing, and today, I look at it as a triangle. There was the Spruce Falls paper mill in Kapuskasing. There were the farmers who I really didn't understand their role, and that was really, really important for my understanding. And then the unionized bushworkers. And I think we need to discuss what all that meant at the time, and maybe start with any one of those 3, Andy, the mill. And of course, the mill had the big client of the New York Times. And so that was another aspect of this whole thing. And I call it the anatomy or of a mistake or a perfect storm. I think it was bound to happen, and just everything came together, unfortunately.
I like your analogy of the perfect storm because that probably hits the nail on the head. Yes, you had the multinational, Kimberly-Clark, that owned 51% of Spruce Falls Pulp and Paper Mill, and the New York Times owned the other 49%. You had these settlers who were also referred to in newspapers as independents, as jobbers, farmers, and so that can be confusing to anyone. So I had to work pretty hard at trying to make that clear so people wouldn't be confused. The strikers, who were often related to the settlers and came from the same kind of background, were opposed to them and saw them as scabs. So that's something you don't see in most union disputes. You don't see that kind of conflict. And they're not scabs in the sense that they were taking their jobs, but they were always there producing about 25% of the wood that the pulp and paper mill needed to produce their newsprint. So, it can be very confusing because of all that. And then to make it even more confusing, Kimberly-Clark owned the mill in Long Lac, which produced a slightly different product and used different materials, ingredients in the production, and their costs had gone up, and they wanted to negotiate a settlement that involved both groups, the people in Long Lac and the bushworkers in Kapuskasing. And that's where the real problem occurred.
Yeah, I think there was that timeline where things got simmering and were kind of left over, and too much time went on. The farmers, again, the unionized bushworkers, I know there were family lines even, in fact, that were crossed over with regards to the farmers. And I did not realize, again, that they were, by the government, they were given holdings or plots to cut that 25% of the wood. And of course, the mill needed it. And of course, the unionized bushworkers are against that. But nonetheless, and then they didn't realize the stockpiling of wood the pulpwood at the siding, the railway siding, and that's why it's called the Reesor Siding Incident. That on that fateful night, and it had occurred apparently that the piles had been disrupted beforehand, and then of course the X number of 100 people, I think as many as 400 came upon them, and the Ontario Provincial Police were there. They could do, I think, very little as the mob approached, and shots were fired, and all hell broke out, so to speak. But take us to that incident and the kind of the lead up to the night.
Well, from a Hunka, which is near Smooth Rock Falls, to Hearst, there were incidents of violence, and there was a history to that. There had been strikers who'd been imprisoned for assault several years before. So it wasn't anything new. And they were doing all kinds of things. There were verbal threats, telephone threats. They had signs, the strikers, where wood was being piled by the settlers, that said, "Abat or Amar les colons," or "Amar les scabs," death to the scabs. So that's pretty strong language. There were assaults in bars, in grocery stores. My brother was telling me what he was called at a scene on a sunny afternoon in Hearst, where somebody's car had been turned onto its roof. So these big, strong guys who worked as lumberjacks were able to take a car and turn it over onto its roof. So there were all kinds of things that were done to create tension. And the police seemed to be, to passersby, seemed to be unwilling or unable or both to do anything about it. They were always outnumbered. So if you had two police officers in a cruiser and 40, 50 tough lumberjacks, there wasn't much that they could do. And I think they were told not to accelerate and not to incite any kind of violence or get themselves into that situation. So they were tremendously restrained, and they showed that night because even with all the shooting that took place, and the shooting involved them, they were right in between the strikers and the shooters, and they were knocked down. That's why they weren't hit, but several of them had holes in their uniforms or in their parkas, and so that it came pretty close. And of course, it's the dark of night. It just happened at midnight, 12:30 in the morning. And so police officers could have been shot. They were knocked down by both sides. But the strikers running towards the wood pile and then running back after they were shot. It was an inflammatory situation. It could have been much worse. Had the police drawn their guns and got involved, it would have been really ugly.
Yeah, not only that I wonder too, the bushwalkers, thank goodness, did not have firearms, or if they did, they didn't discharge them at the time.
Well, and they threatened in dialogue with the police officers at the scene. They were so upset about seeing their friend shot that they were threatening to go home and get their guns. And the police did a great job of talking them down and saying, "Leave it. If you'd let us do our jobs, this wouldn't have happened. And you have to let us do our jobs now. And we're taking care of this situation. You go home and go to bed." And but the way this thing developed, they created this cavalcade of cars from probably Fauquier, came through places like Moonbeam, Brunetteville, Kapuskasing, Opasatica, and they just, cars kept getting in line until there was about 100 cars. Every car had at least 4 guys in it, sometimes 5 and 6. I know that because in the police reports, they have the license plates, the make and model of the car, and the men who were in them. And often there were 6 men in these cars. So I'll have the details, for example, a 62 green Studebaker, license number such and such, and then the names of the 6 people who were in the car. So this was a very large group of men. I don't know what kind of shape they were in at midnight, but I know that some of them, when they were interviewed by the police, admitted that didn't remember anything because they were drunk. So you put booze into that, and 350 of them could have been sober, but if 100 of them weren't, it's still a volatile situation. And what they did, they got out of their cars, they walked down the road and to the narrow road that went up towards these settlers had a shack and had their wood piled, and so they created a funnel, and the guys at the back were pushing. Everybody's yelling and screaming, and nobody could hear anything. And when the guns started to go off, everyone thought they were hearing firecrackers. Both the strikers who gave testimony and the police in their reports all said that they thought they'd heard firecrackers. So quite a confusing situation. Really a mob mentality among the strikers, kind of out of control, and not supported by their leadership. So,
yeah, you point a number of these things out in the book, and we want the listeners to buy the Reesor Siding Tragedy, because it should not be called an incident. It is a tragedy. And one thing I want to say too, you did a great job of explaining the French-Canadian context, because the context of that, they were bushworkers and the farmers, and there's still a strong French-Canadian presence in Northern Ontario. But back in the day, some of the first settlers were French-Canadian, as promoted by the Roman Catholic Church. But explain that to the listeners as well, about the makeup of the people, the cultural makeup of the people involved.
Yeah, for example, Hearst is currently a town of about 12,000, with probably a Francophone population of 93%. But when it started, it was an English-speaking community, quite small. But the Catholic Church started to encourage migration from agricultural areas in Quebec, because I think they saw that, with these large families that had been produced over the years, there wasn't enough land for example, your oldest son might be able to take over from you if you're a farmer in Lac Saint Jean area, but the other 7 boys had to find land somewhere else. And so it was kind of a natural thing for them to migrate to some other place where they might get land for fairly cheap and be able to eke out a living. Because you have to remember, there's no social safety net in those days. There's no credit. You had to work to get some cash so that you could buy food. Otherwise, you had to grow your own and hunt and fish to survive. So that move paid off. And from about 1922 to 1960, the Catholic Church established, I think, 28 parishes in that Highway 11 corridor. Bishop Hawley, who's a distant relative of mine, was the leader of that movement, and actually brought some members of his own family to that area. A lot of priests in Quebec encouraged members of their families to move to this area. And so that's how it started. And but a lot of the bush workers who worked in the CAP or worked for Spruce Falls, let's say, and were members of that union, a lot of those fellows came from small towns in Quebec close to the Ontario border. So places like La Sarre, Quebec, Talmarol, Duparquet. And so they were commuters. Often they commuted on a weekly basis or every second week or whatever, because they could get home in a matter of hours. Those who came from further away tended to build themselves a home and settle there. So, but on Sundays, these people were worshiping at the same churches. The men who were in town were dating girls from these farms. So there was lots of connections between people, and it created a lot of friction.
Yeah, I imagine. And there's so much to unpack, right, in this whole dispute, because it isn't just one side. You've got aggression from both sides. And one of the most interesting things is the fact that, the police knew that the farmers brought their guns, right? They didn't do anything. They didn't do anything to stop it. So I guess
the 12 police officers at the scene all in the report said that they were not aware that there were guns there. The police officer who knew was their boss, who was in Kapuskasing, who'd had a meeting that evening with a group of met with him at the Cap Inn and said, "Look, there's something brewing at Reesor Siding. The settlers there, they have guns, and there are hundreds of strikers on their way there." And he was in radio contact with those officers, and it doesn't seem that he ever told them to watch out for the guns from the settlers or to disarm them, because they could have easily done it.
Wow, and the other thing too, like legally, is I believe I read that all the people who shot ended up having their charges dropped, right? I believe is what it said.
Well, they weren't dropped. They were imprisoned in Haileybury, and in September, so this happened in February.
Yeah.
I think September 30th, the fall assizes in Cochrane were being held, and they were transported there for grand jury investigation. And the grand jury met for this bill. They could have issued a true bill or a no bill. The no bill means that there's no charges. And because a grand jury hearing is held in camera or in private session, we don't know what was said in there, what evidence was presented, and we may never know. So, but apparently the police knew which guns fired which bullets into which people. They just couldn't prove which man was holding which gun at the time.
Wow.
And of course, gun ownership and registration didn't exist, and so these were 410s, 22s, 303, 30-30, that kind of weapon. And 12-gauge shotgun was probably the one used the most and was the most lethal, because some of the wounded and the dead were hit by shotgun pellets.
Yeah, and the unionized bushworkers, this is now post incident, the union paid for their fines, and again, you point out in the book, the arbitration and settlement occurred fairly soon after, and I don't want to say the whole thing was forgotten, because it wasn't forgotten, but it just seemed like it didn't need to happen, but it happened because of the perfect storm, and then the next thing you know, it's all over.
Yes, and people demanded a royal commission, and of course the government wasn't interested in doing that because they might have looked bad. And at the time of the fall assizes in Cochrane, the provincial election was being held, and so right at that time, on October 1st or 2nd, the election was held, and the Conservative Party of John Robarts won a huge victory. So it was like a landslide. So, and they were in power and had been for some time. So that was the end of any story about a royal commission or any kind of investigation into why it happened.
Yeah, now organized labor has brought us the 5-day work week and the 40-hour work week and vacations and all kinds of safety standards and acts that have made for a better workplace. And as you go through the research, and now as having you've got the book done and published and so on and so forth, what are your takeaways now, Andy, when you look back at that and from a number of different perspectives?
Well, on the whole issue of unions and management, and because I've been a chief negotiator for both sides, I think it's really important that egos don't get in the way. I think that also you can't be undercut. I mean, there can be a lot of savagery that goes on behind the scenes with these groups of management and union leaders. the union leader in this case the president was Joseph LaForce, and he seemed to be a really intelligent, well-meaning person. He was totally in the dark about all these things that were happening up there. And in fact, most of the bad incidents happened when he was in Toronto at the negotiating table. And so he wasn't in charge. The rumor in Kapuskasing was that there was a member of his executive who, had the attitude that while the cat's away, the mice will be, kind of thing. And he was taking advantage of the situation to fire up this group of people, and also use the threat of them not getting any strike pay if they didn't participate. Quite a few of them said that in their testimony to the police, that I had to go because otherwise my family would starve. I needed the $25 a week, or I needed the $15 a week. They received different amounts, and it must have been based on their situation. So single men probably got the lowest amount, and a man with a couple of kids probably got the largest amount. The other factor that we haven't mentioned is that the New York Times was in a strike situation. So 49% ownership of Spruce Falls. They're in a strike situation at their newspaper in New York City. And all 7 New York City daily newspapers were shut down from the end of November 62 until March 31st, 63. So the demand for newsprint was almost negative, almost nil. So for over 4 months. So these guys picked really the worst time to get involved in a wildcat strike.
Yeah, one of the things that I think about is, because this is back in the 60s. It's a much different world now. This is now 60 years prior. It would be really interesting to see if this were to happen today. And I'm sure there are disputes that go that way. You don't hear too much about it in Canada, but if this happened today, with the amount of social media and just the internet at large, it kind of, not that the company got away scot-free, but we do deal with it's more about the union and it's more about these farmers. How much blowback did the company get based off of this?
Yeah, I think the company got away scot-free with this thing. And they were really to blame, because in their negotiations, it was clear that they were in no hurry. I mean, but all the times they sat down at the table, they never got to the point of accepting rules of behavior. Now, in most sour negotiations, you deal with that in the first 10 minutes. You come in with a sheet, you say, okay, we agree that we won't air out our differences in the newspapers. We agree that we'll keep our tempers in check, and we won't use obscene language or that kind of thing. So you agree to a whole bunch of things. So we're gonna behave, and here's how we're gonna follow, and who's gonna speak first, and how we're gonna respond to that. And so they never got to agree to that. Days and days of negotiations, never got to agree to those kinds of terms even. And, one interesting tidbit, when they were in Toronto, the government decided to send in an arbitrator or a mediator, and they asked a young law professor from the University of Toronto named Bora Laskin. And Bora Laskin became the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada. I would have loved to have seen his notes on it, but I wasn't able to find anything. But I'm sure there's something somewhere that he's written. He only got into it on the weekend that the Reesor siding occurred.
Yeah, so knowing what you know now about, because you have a pretty intimate knowledge of all the stuff that happened, obviously, doing the research, writing a novel about it, what do you think was the tipping point for this to happen? Do you think this was, and who do you think, I guess, was more at fault for kind of what happened? Is there one point in your research that you go, if this was different, this wouldn't have happened?
I think the company's approach to negotiating with them was off from the very beginning. And they had been engaging in something called pattern bargaining. So in the car industry, for example, if Chrysler negotiates a deal, then Ford and General Motors follows through. That's pattern bargaining, and the workers at all three companies kind of get a similar deal. So in the pulp and paper industry, it was the same, and they had been doing that for years. And Abitibi had settled the previous year with its, I guess, 5 mills in Sault Ste. Marie, Nipigon, the Iroquois Falls, Smooth Rock Falls, and the Lakehead. So they had agreements. Now these strikers in Cap all had relatives in those other towns. They had brothers. Like 2 of the men who were killed that night, brother who came from Nipigon for the funeral. So the talking went on between these people, especially in the summertime when they were all home, and so they knew what the working conditions were like. They knew what the food was like. They knew what the pay was, and it didn't take much for them to resent not having the same standards as a friend or relative down the road had. And that knowledge, I think, was, and then you had the company coming out, and I use the expression in the book. They were throwing gasoline on the fire. And some of the comments they were making weren't helpful, and they shouldn't have been making them to the press. And they proposed outlandish things like, okay, so you guys have been out of work. You haven't been cutting wood for the last month. So when we get back, you're going to have to work 7 days a week till we're caught up. Well, 7 days a week means you never come out of the bush. So you're in the bush every day of the week. And so you're in the bush camp. You've got a wife and child somewhere that you're not going to see for maybe months. So that's a no-go rate. And they had to know that's a non-starter. But I think they were just stalling. They were playing games.
Yeah, that kind of goes back to the, if it happened in today's world, you'd never get away with that, because you're basically, the company is kind of coming at it from, we need to fill our quotas. We don't really care about you personally as a human. We just want to fill our quotas. And I can just imagine the first thing you'd have just all over social media and everything would just be like, look at how bad this company is. So it's crazy. Bill, why don't you tell us a little bit there? I found really interesting. This is in your article. There were a couple of songs written about this tragedy. Very famously, Stompin' Tom wrote one, and he actually got some threats after he sang it.
Yeah, it's in Andy's book about Stompin' Tom. Did one after the fact. He was the great storyteller, and of course the story goes somewhat that when he did sing it in Timmins, there was some pushback, and then Charlie Angus,
Kapuskasing.
Yeah, in Kapuskasing, Charlie Angus and the Grievous Angels have sang about this as well from a labor perspective, so to speak, and so it's not often, I think, that songs do get written about instances, but there you go. And Stompin' Tom, I think, felt the brunt of some pushback from the incident. The one thing I wanted to ask Andy as well, this monument is between Kapuskasing and Hearst, between Matisse and Opasadica, so to speak. And often when I travel that road, and again, I call that stretch of Highway 11 the land of broken promises and shattered dreams, because people did come into that area, promised, whether it was through the church or state, and try to eke out existence in the Canadian Shield, although it is the larger clay belt and some fertile farming. All that's gone. You can still see the remains where nature has taken over these farmsteads on both sides of the highway. And but tell us a little bit about the monument as it now stands today, Andy.
Well, I think the important thing of the monument, it was the union's way of recognizing the 3 men who were killed and the 8 men who were wounded, and so their names are on the monument. They had quite a gathering, I guess, for the unveiling of the monument in 1966. They brought the families of the deceased in. It was kind of sad when you see the pictures of those people, the widow with the two young kids, and a mom and dad, probably in their 60s, who came from Saint-Elzéar, Quebec, which is about 30 minutes out of Quebec City. So their son had come a long way to work in the woods near Kapuskasing, and to end up dead in a snowbank at Reesor Siding is pretty tragic, and that's why the name is so appropriate. I mean, I struggled with, what do I call this? Some people refer to it as an incident. Some people refer to it as a riot. One newspaper man at the time called it the Muskeg Massacre. So it wasn't a massacre. It wasn't just a riot, and it wasn't just an incident. And the only word you can come with, I think, is tragedy, because it was a tragedy not only for the people who were shot, the people who did the shooting. I mean, imagine how stupid you would feel that you were guarding a load of lumber with guns and prepared to kill people who wanted to start throwing your logs around. Because all that meant was more work that you'd have to do. It's not really worth somebody's life. But they got carried away with all the stuff that had been going on, and on both sides, they weren't thinking straight. And that's where I'm fascinated by the whole thing. What happens to people when you're part of a group? That whole mob psychology thing, that you do things that you wouldn't normally do.
Exactly. And it's another aspect of the story, that mob mentality when the adrenaline kicks in. I also say in the story, not yet published, that where the monument is, there's a realm of coniferous trees in the background. And I say, just kind of after the fact, the trees were really important in the story. And when you think about it, because we're in at the time, a resource-based economy, which holds true to today in Northern Ontario, the trees it was all about the trees and how needed the trees were. When you think about it, it was so.
And still, yeah. So if you drove by in the past year, as I have, there's still a tremendous amount of logging going on. It's fueling the lumber mills in Hearst for sure. And I found that Kapuskasing and Hearst, of all of our Northern Ontario towns, seem to be the most prosperous right now.
Well, they're most prosperous and have been, when you think about their history, the most resilient as well.
Exactly. Yeah. Like Iroquois Falls is pretty much lost everything. The mill is closed, and so I felt like I had so many things that drew me to this story, because Kapuskasing is a company town. I grew up in a company town, so born and raised in one. Know all about the paper making process, the wood process, how we brought them down the river. I worked on the river. I worked in the bush. I worked in different departments in the mill. So you get to know all of that stuff. I spent most of my adult life involved in negotiations, basically as an extra to my jobs. But you get that experience of how easy these things can go off the rails, and and I've had relatives in all those towns all this time. I still do, and so kind of have a flavor and a foot in the different camps. I'm equally at home in English as I am in French, but my love of the North is, even though I'm not there and haven't been full time for many years, I still yearn for it. So, and I care about the people.
That's awesome. And again, this is I think it's so important to put this this story into light. Like I'm I guess younger. I'm 30 now, Is that considered young? I don't know.
Ben is always learning, Andy, on the Backroads Bill podcast about all these things, and this is a valuable lesson in this story. But go ahead, Ben.
But this is just, I've never heard of this before, right? So when I first heard about this, I'm like, this is a big lesson in reflection on how you deal with these labor disputes, and it's crazy to think about that it happens in the backyard. So, Andy, your novel, The Reesor Siding Tragedy, Canada's Bloodiest Labour Conflict, it's available. You can find it on Amazon. You can also find it on, I think it's friesenpress.com, I believe is how you pronounce it.
Yeah, Friesen is the publisher.
Yep.
Friesen Press. And it's available almost through any bookstore as well. But when you Google the Reesor Siding Tragedy, all of these things come up. You get but for people who don't have a computer or a phone that they Google on, it's a bit tougher. But that's why I'm doing the rounds of libraries in the small towns and making presentations.
Absolutely.
So that they get a chance to purchase it through me, and they get it cheaper that way as well.
That's awesome. Yeah, I did see that you have some upcoming stuff in the beginning of October. We will be in Kapuskasing and Matisse in Wasaga Beach. Just as we wrap up here, just a quick, from doing this, what was the big takeaway, the big lesson that you personally took from this whole tragedy and story?
Well, I think the word that Ben used, I think reflection. It causes reflection. I wanted to have people reflect on and maybe develop an ability to think critically about the kinds of situations we find ourselves in with groups, and where there's someone who's using inflammatory language and trying to stir us up. I mean, the greatest example we have in the last few years is January 6th in Washington, D.C. But we now see in Canada on a regular basis that when there are conflicts between people and the police are involved, the police have terms of engagement that some of us would want them to get more tougher on the people who are the hottest, and they don't. And we're critical of them that way, but they're doing the right thing. They're not escalating. And if you noticed recently, the railway workers were going to go on strike, and CN and CP were both going to be shut down. And the federal government stepped in and said, "No, you're not. We'll send that to arbitration." The governments are taking action sooner, and they have throughout my adult life. And there's always politics involved. You get the politicians who are in favor of the unions coming out and saying, "No, the government shouldn't do this. Let the company work it out with the union." But you're asking for trouble when you do that often. So they stepped in before it gets too wild, and I think that's a lesson maybe they've learned, maybe from Reesor, but since it's the only one I think where we've had death, it's probably the one that taught the greatest lesson and maybe passed down from government to government.
We've learned a great deal today, Andy, about the Reesor Siding tragedy, and it was a tragedy. But you're the perfect person to explain the emotional part and all the dots. And again, we started off by saying about this perfect storm. And it is one of those Northern Ontario stories. It has national and international significance, but it occurred in the North. And even we should not forget, Ben, about these things, and everyone else. And for me, too, it's far too often we just say, "Oh, I'll stop at that roadside historic plaque," and this time I was glad I stopped, and of course I think serendipitously ran into you, and we're glad to have you on this Backroads Bill podcast, and thank you so much.
Well, a big thank you to Andy for joining us. Again, there's so many questions that kept popping up in my mind. And, labor disputes happen all the time. As Andy mentioned, recently the big railway companies tried to, but were shot down by the federal government, but also here in Ontario. Recently, we had the LCBO strike. We had an ONR strike that was very, very quick and basically didn't really affect too much on their day-to-day. And, you always think if those got equally as heated and it had the same amount of violence, how would we as a society react? And I know I brought that up in the episode, but it is something very interesting to think about. So if you enjoyed this episode and want to listen to more of the Backroads Bill podcast, you can find us on your favorite podcast platforms with new episodes arriving every single Wednesday morning. And of course, always available on NorthBayEcho.ca. And while you are on the North Bay Echo website, you can check out all the other great local shows we have going on, like To North Bay with Love, where yesterday Lisa sat down with Cassidy Bale, who's a nutrition and fitness coach. She's also the daughter of Maureen Cassidy, who, if you're in kind of the arts culture here in North Bay, you might know she's a fantastic actor. She was the Campbell Soup mom for a long time. We actually had an episode with her and Lisa. So really interesting listen. You can check it out on NorthBayEcho.ca. Also check out Echo Essentials. Scott and Dave last week had Paul McLean on. If you've ever been in Source for Sports, he's the owner there. But he came onto the show not to talk about Source for Sports, but to talk baseball, the North Bay Panthers, and really how him and his team are kind of changing the landscape of youth baseball in North Bay. So that wraps things up for us this week. Join us again next Wednesday for another Backroads adventure.